change to address this global phenomenon of climate change. And being impressed by that, it's also a task I need to explain. We all need to explain what that means. What is a post-colonial perspective and why is it necessary? What can it contribute? So that's sort of my task that I've put to myself. And I want to give you some insights that I had, some claims, some arguments, and I hope for a discussion about them afterwards. I need to, yes, to take here, not here.
Yeah,
yes.
I also have to get rid of this bar. How do I get rid of that bar?
Aber normalerweise ist es können transportieren mit dem drauf. Es ist nur nicht klar, wo es muss, also mit diesen Pfeilen oder gibt es man muss draufklicken. Das kann transportiert natürlich.
Ja. Stört es, wenn es da oben ist?
Nein. Nein, das stört mich nicht.
Okay.
Ich muss nur meine Slides transportieren.
Und dann können wir da weiter.
Jetzt geht's weiter. Yeah. Sometimes solutions are very simple, but not for the climate crisis, unfortunately. It's an immensely complex issue. And it's an immensely complex issue of injustice also, not only of atmospheric changes, of climate processes around the globe. They have effects, they have consequences for living beings, including humans, around the world. And I think there are essentially three dimensions of injustice that we need to keep in mind. One is the north-south dimension. The rich countries, the poor countries. This is the classical colonial relationship. The other is the present-future dimension. Present generations, including young people, old people, but then the next generations who are not yet living, do they have also rights to a good biosphere to live in? And how can we enforce these rights in the present? Lawyers, they talk about the advance validity of basic rights, Vorwirkung von Grundrechten. And I think this needs also to be a topic in the ethics in the dimension of present-future. And then we have the human, non-human dimension, which is not uncontroversial to be described with terms of justice and injustice, because normally justice and injustice is just between humans. But I think we can understand what it means to be unjust also to non-human beings, to forests, to valleys, to mountains, to biospheres or biospheric places. It's of course a task then to spell that out and to explain that in understandable terms, what that means. I will argue that all these three dimensions of injustice have something to do with climate colonialism, with colonialism. There is a colonialism also to the future, and there is also colonialism to nature in an applied sense, of course, not in the direct sense, it's an indirect sense, but my argument, my main argument here is that we can learn something from the classical colonial relationship and post-colonial processes for also the other dimensions of climate colonialism. But of course, we need to now I close this computer, otherwise I get confused. We need to answer the question, why is that injustice? Is the suffering climate change is causing an injustice, and why is it an injustice? Why are differences in human suffering? Ones are suffering, the others are perhaps benefiting. Why is the harm done to certain people unjust? To clarify this question, I propose to turn to a political philosopher, Judith Shklar, who wrote a very, very recommendable book, The Faces of Injustice, in 1990, and proposed the distinction between injustice and misfortune. Her distinctive feature of injustice is it's a suffering, a harm done by humans to others, which would be preventable. Just simple as that. And misfortune is an unpreventable harm. But Shklar is very reflective about it and sees that this distinction is not straightforward. I quote from her book here: "We must recognize that the line of separation between injustice and misfortune is a political choice, not a simple rule that can be taken as a given." So she is not just applying the definition and then it's straightforward. The question is thus not whether to draw a line between them at all, but where to do so in order to enhance responsibility and to avoid random retaliation. So it has also implications. If we address something as injustice, then it has different implications, political ones, legal ones, moral ones, than when we would address it as misfortune. A misfortune can be perhaps avoided by running away, by installing preventive measures, but an injustice is an issue under law, under morality. It causes guilt, or is a subject of responsibility, and so on, and is also a cause for political fights against injustice. So if something is unjust, it has consequences for a social process and for how societies address it and respond to it in political and also in philosophical ways. Now we have injustice. When we look into classical philosophical ethics, injustice appears, yes, also justice. Philosophers, they deal more with justice than with injustice. If you go to John Rawls or to Immanuel Kant, you will find much more mentionings of the word Gerechtigkeit and justice than of the contrary. And the same is the case for the ethical term of the good and the evil. Philosophers, they very often deal with the good and reflect about what is the right kind of action, what is the best rule to govern action, and so on. And perhaps what are the wrong ones, what are the defective ones. Kant would say a rule that is not possible to be universalized, that it is not possible to wish that everybody follows this rule, is a defective rule. But he would not use the term evil to describe that. Evil was then in the Enlightenment philosophy pushed out of the discourse to theology. Theologians, they had to do with evil because they dealt with guilt, things with sin. And for philosophers, that was difficult things to deal with, not rational in a way. I want to argue with Claudia Carr, the feminist philosopher of the 20th century, that something has got lost with that exclusion of the evil. We need the term of evil also to describe what is going on, especially in the 20th century, as Carr argues, where big atrocities took place from the Holocaust on. Wars, we have now another atrocity going on in the Ukraine. And it's not just wrongdoing there, it's evil. But what is evil? Let's listen to Claudia Carr's very careful description or definition even of what evil is. She has two versions of it. One appeared in her earlier book, The Atrocity Paradigm, which I have here, Oxford University Press, 2002. And her definition is very simple. Evils are reasonable, foreseeable, intolerable harms produced by culpable wrongdoing. So harms, foreseeable, reasonably foreseeable, did I make an error? Yeah, reasonably should be. And they are produced by culpable wrongdoing. So wrong is a part of injustice and evil, but not only that, it must be intolerable harm and reasonably foreseeable intolerable harm. In her later version, in her second book about these topics, Confronting Evils, Terrorism, Torture, and Genocide, she makes an amendment of that definition in one part, the last one, culpable wrongdoing, she replaces by inexcusable wrongs. From the experience of the discussion after her first book, she draws the conclusion that it needs some clarification, and this is also the reason she gives for this amendment. I quote her, "This revision preserves and clarifies culpability in the evil deeds of individuals, and it allows an improved account of evil institutions." And this is important because in climate change, we have not individual evil, it's an evil in structure, if it is an evil at all. The climate change is a phenomenon that is not caused by evil people. Nobody even has an intention to cause climate change. It's an unintended side effect of intended things, flying around, driving around, running machines, running industry, and so on, for whatever goals, but never for changing the climate. Nobody wants to change the climate. It just happens. And people cannot nearly do nothing about it. They are helpless. So the individuals, even the managers of institutions, they are of course, they are complicit of that in a way, but their contribution is not to be captured with the term "they are the evil people." They are not the evil, like in the media, Vladimir Putin is the evil guy for the war in the Ukraine, and we have no evil guy for the climate change in the same sense. It's a product of a global, immensely complex network of social practices that have an effect of distributing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. And to understand this process is very demanding, and nobody, I think, has really described it yet fully. So evil, in Carr's new definition, is very clearly also a thing that can happen in institutions, or we could add in social structures. Carr's definition she's clear about it, she should also be applicable to the perspective of the victims. So it's depending on harm, not so much as it depends on the intention on the side of those who commit the evil. So an evil in Kant's term can be evil even if those who commit the deeds that are evil have not a bad intention. So evil can happen also as a result of acts that are well intended. That's not the defining moment. The intention behind is not the defining moment. It's about the harm caused and whether it is foreseeable and could be prevented, could be done something about it, and so on. So an evil is in itself an injustice in Sklar's term, but it's another term in another context, another terminology more in philosophical ethics than in political philosophy. Kant, I was when I read it first time, I was surprised. In 2002, mentions in her list of examples for atrocities. It begins with the Holocaust, of course, then bombings of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo, Hamburg, Dresden. She goes on to the genocides in Rwanda, Burundi, and East Timor, the killing fields of Cambodia, and then and the threat to life on our planet posed by environmental poisoning, global warming, and the destruction of rainforests and other natural habitats. So she includes that without giving an argument for it, but for her, it is part of this phenomenon that she wants to address with the term evil. When we listen to the reports about the effects of climate change, I think that there can be no doubt that we are in this category of intolerable harm that is caused by human actions and must be addressed with terms of injustice and evil, even atrocities. The last report of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was published at end of February this year. It's quite a complicated document. That's only the summary for policymakers, 30 pages, very densely written 30 pages. So I went to The Guardian to explain that, because it's also important to see how the media explain it to the general public. And when you listen to that or read that, I think we're quite clear that it's very dramatic. 3.5 billion people are heavily vulnerable to climate impacts, and half the world's population suffers severe water shortages at some point each year, and so on. Or the last paragraph here, even if the world keeps heating below 1.6 Celsius by 2100, and we are already at plus 1.1 Celsius, then 8% of today's farmland will become climatically unsuitable just after the global population has peaked above 9 billion. Severe stunting could affect 1 million children in Africa alone. If global heating continues and little adaptation is put in place, 183 million more people, according to the estimation of the IPCC report, more people are projected to go hungry by 2050. So millions of people going hungry. This is real serious harm done to people. So we need this drastic vocabulary, and not just saying it's it's wrong or it's impermissible to continue on this. This is too light language, too generous language. We need the drastic language here.
There's people in the chat commenting or maybe asking questions.
We decided that we ask the questions in the end,
Okay.
but I collect them and we'll ask them.
Okay. Or we can also read the fact sheet published by the World Health Organization last year. Just read the point 4, areas with weak health infrastructure, mostly in developing countries, will be the least able to cope without assistance to prepare and respond. It has health impacts, not just food impacts or ecological impacts. It has direct health impacts, and I'm very glad that the WHO has seen that as an issue and as part of its responsibility to go public with reports such as these, because when health is put into the political realm, many more people, policymakers are taking it seriously, as when we just discuss about species going extinct or ecological stress on forests or things like that. Politicians, they tend to not taking that so serious as when health of humans is affected. I skipped that. This is an explanation why or where health impacts can be a consequence of climate change. You can look at these fact sheets yourself. They're quite easy to find on the internet. Let's look at that. And then we are in the middle of this colonialism debate. This is a very dramatic visualization of, on the top, the cumulative national carbon dioxide emissions between 1950 and 2000. And it's also, it's always that the geographical size of each nation is proportional to its impact. So it's not the geographical size, it's the size according to the impact to the emissions. And you see Europe, North America is very thick. And the lower panel is about the effects. The distribution of 4 climate-related causes of death: malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and flood-related fatalities, according to estimations between 2000 and 2030. We are already in 2022. And you see the proportions are just the contrary. The countries in the global south are the thick ones. South America, Latin America is not so much affected here than Africa is or India is. But the northern countries, the US, Europe, are quite thin. They are not affected so much in terms of mortalities due to the climate change. Of course, this has many assumptions, and we should check how the figures are calculated, whether the data are reliable and so on. I cannot go into that, but if we would take that seriously, we would need to check it out and to read the original publication in EcoHealth 2007. The graph was reproduced, and I found it there in the book by Samuel Myers and others, Planetary Health in 2020. And I choose it because it's so impressive. But of course, scientifically, it needs to be scrutinized. But I'm sure that it has something in it which is true. Because also other calculations, they point into a similar direction. Here you have, we cannot see it very well here. We need to, yes, who emits the most CO2? Put that underneath for a moment. This is the actual emission distribution. You see China is the highest distributor of CO2, followed by the US and then the EU. Drawn in another way, here is the historical development of that. Yes, here. From the beginning of industrialization, late 19th century, before it was nearly zero emission of CO2. And then you see how the proportions developed, and today we have China as the biggest contributor, followed by the United States and then EU. And Africa, the little blue one on top, is very small. But this is just an actual emission graph. When you look at the historical cumulative figures, yes, then the proportions are quite different. Here, the cumulative figures of CO2 emissions are plotted between, again, late 19th century until 2017. And here you see the EU has about the same proportion as the United States, and both of them have each a much larger proportion in historical emissions than China has. So even if China is now the biggest emitter, historically it has contributed much less than the United States and the EU. But very interesting is this graph. Who was this at the start? So the first country who nearly made 100% of CO2 emissions was just the UK, because there the whole industrialization was invented, so to speak. They had the first James Watt with the we invented this steam engine, and the coal was used for that. And then other countries, they came in, and now, of course, the UK is a quite a little contributor. This figure is a very political one. It's the Keeling curve, the carbon dioxide concentration measured in Hawaii in an observatory of the Scripps Institutes of Oceanography. It's the main data reference for CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, and the measurements started around 1960 by a guy named Keeling. Therefore, it's the Keeling curve, and you can check it out online, updated each day. The last one, when I checked it out, it was February 3rd this year, and you see between 1960 to now, we have an increase of CO2 concentration by about 100 parts per million, which is about 1/3 of what it was before. The political thing here and the worrying aspect of that is that all the efforts, the international efforts of climate politics have no effect in this to these dynamics. So when you see Paris 2015, the Paris Agreement, this scaling curve goes quite as it was before, and it is, we now see what exponential curves are. The COVID pandemic has made us see exponential curves. It is an exponential curve. That's a straight line, the red one, and it's still exponential. We can see here, it is still going on exponentially upward. And a beautiful thing is this yearly fluctuation. It's just the vegetation. If plants are growing, then CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere, and in winter it's increasing again. So you can see in these yearly fluctuation like the breathing of the biosphere, so to speak. Historically, the same curve drawn backward, not from measurements directly because nobody was there measuring, but from ice core probes, and included air in bubbles. You can measure with gas chromatography how much CO2 was in it, and then you can see that the increase is really a phenomenon of the last part of the latter half of the 20th century. It was nearly a constant going back to the year 1700, and in this graph here it's elongated until minus 10,000 years ago, and you see it was very flat, and the increase is dramatic at the end, going to now about the double of what it was until 1,000 years ago, about. When you go longer to minus 800,000 years ago, you see many fluctuations, the ice ages and so on. Humans appeared around here on Earth, but it was never above 250. What we have now, human caused, is 420. And here's the station where it is measured. Now, a little break, no figures, no numbers again. An artistic approach to the phenomenon of climate. I found this photo in Sebastião Salgado's Genesis project. He's a wonderful photographer and took that image, that picture in the north of Ethiopia. And it shows very, very nicely, symbolically also, but aesthetically, how humans living on these surfaces there and doing their agriculture there and looking for their living, how they are related to what is going on above with this, the weather, the light, the clouds, the weather process, the atmospheric processes. They are including these human livelihoods, the human living practices. They could not be successful without a beneficial climate, which made me think, what is climate? Is climate something that takes place just outside of our rooms? No, climate does not take place outside. We are, as human bodies, embodied and emplaced as active and also as passive subjects, as parts of the biosphere and of the atmospheric system. So we are part of it, part of that climate. It goes through our bodies. We breathe in and out the air and share this air with all the other beings in the biosphere. And also with the machines that evaporate CO2. What we call climate as average weather, climatologists, they say a climate is average weather, is not the weather at one point in time. It's about 20 years they take as a range, and the average weather, that's the climate of a place of Northern Europe, for example, or Middle Europe. But this is, from a phenomenological, philosophical point of view, not very satisfying definition. It's an objective definition, useful in climatology, but I would rather go into that direction, that we see coldness or hotness of air, for example, from our human body experience. And what is cold is not the cold air outside, it's the connection between the cold air and the human body. This is cold. When somebody is feeling cold, this is cold. Cold is not a temperature, it's the effect or something in between the human body or a living body and what is about it. So it characterizes a relationship between humans, other life and Earth. And climate is, I think, to be redescribed after climatology as from a phenomenological point of view, as something in between living beings and environments. And it's an important relationship because all life depends on it. This is a little hint to environmental phenomenology. Now, what can be learned from a post-colonial perspective? I excuse I did not translate this quote from Maria Domar Castro Varela and Nikita Daman. They wrote a wonderful introductory book about post-colonial theory, also mentioning climate change here. The situation where we find us is influenced through the heritage of colonialism. From climate change to refugee crisis, to societal controversies about the role of religion, to questions about rights of minorities and citizenship. Yes, thank you. Everywhere, the hundreds of years long colonial systems have left their traces. And post-colonial theories, they try to help us to understand these enmeshed pasts and futures, so that we should not repeat our historical mistakes and what people have avoided, and also the crimes that have been committed, because we are incapable, not ready to learn from them. So this is the quite dramatically said, the aim of post-colonial theory, which I very much would like to endorse. But now a little bit more from my own thinking applied to that. I want to make a few points, just a few points, and I know because of time I cannot really explain each of them in depth that it should be explained. I think one point that can be made, climate colonialism, if we use that term, we recognize something in the real world that we would not recognize as such. So carbon and climate colonialism can be seen by this, through this, this lens of post-colonial thought. This is the first point. And the second is, we can also learn something about how social transformations can happen and what are the difficulties that they are faced with. Because the social transformation that is necessary to cope with climate change is certainly of a similar order of magnitude or size than the processes of decolonization have been or still are. And it leads also in part to similar and in part to different difficulties. You can, I think, learn something from the social transformations and the difficulties that happened there, the conflicts that arose in these decolonization processes for the social transformation that need to happen or will happen, organized and unorganized, as a response to climate change. And the third point, the present situation, including the difficulties that we are facing, this as Ingolfur Blüdorn has wonderfully described it as the nachhaltige Nicht-Nachhaltigkeit, the resilient non-sustainability of our systems. Climate change is known since 1950, 1960s. Also, politicians knew it, but they did nothing about it. And the systems, they are very resilient in keeping going as they are and contributing even more to the climate change problem, despite knowing that it causes a problem. So there is a tendency, an inbuilt tendency to counteract these. And we need to reflect about it and to understand what these power dynamics are. And I think there are similarities between these power dynamics than we had it in the power dynamics that kept up the colonial systems against resistance of those oppressed in these systems through centuries. This is the third point. The fourth one, the colonial system was a globalized technique of exploitation and domination based on a single story invented in Europe. The single story term is one of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. You probably know her wonderful TED talk about single stories. If you don't, please check it out. It's a wonderful talk she has there, and she is a Nigerian writer, and she would not call herself perhaps a post-colonial theorist, but she is certainly adopting a post-colonial perspective in that. A mono solution, so a power structure that is applicable to South America, to Africa, to India, wherever exploiters wanted to install it, it worked in the similar way. And we now need to be aware that solutions, they should not be single-story solutions in order to be sustainable solutions. We need to be attentive and inclusive for plural local stories. Of course, much more should be said about that, but just as a point for further discussion here. I pick just two more. The point 5, geoengineering, for example, to change the composition of the atmosphere artificially by spreading little particles that can inflect solar radiation back and cause a cooling of the atmosphere. That would also be a single-story solution. and would probably be unsustainable in all three dimensions of injustice. It would be unsustainable to other countries because only one country would take that decision for all. It would not be a democratically taken decision. It would be unsustainable for the future because they cannot participate in these decisions, which probably would alter the composition of the biosphere very drastically. And it's also unsustainable to the non-human participants in the biosphere. But this is a discussion going on in climate ethics, also among philosophers. And I think we could also contribute something from a post-colonial perspective to that discussion here. The eighth, perhaps, just for the briefness of time, what is the system that needs to be changed? I think the post-colonial discussion has something to add to that question as well. We hear it on the street, climate change, no climate change, system change. But what is the system to be changed? Is it capitalism, as some mean? Is it neoliberalism, as others mean? Is it industry, as some mean? It has also, all of them have consequences, and some are very difficult to change. Some others are perhaps easier to change. All have their difficulties, but we need a discussion. What is the system to be changed? And I think the colonial system is also something that we could analyze and see how can a society change, not be changed by external actors, but change in itself, and how good changes can be cultured or cultivated in a society in order to be inclusive. And the system is not a given, it's a political decision, such as the distinction between injustice and misfortune that we had in the beginning. I come to the conclusions. First, the three dimensions of climate injustice need to be analyzed as three dimensions of climate colonialism. That's just to repeat, that was my basic assumption. Poverty and vulnerability of the global South is a result of centuries of oppression and exploitation by European colonialists, who in this process developed fossil fuel-based industrialism, consumerism, which caused climate change, which hits poor countries harder than rich countries. This is sort of a vicious cycle. We could call it the vicious cycle of climate colonialism. And the post-colonial perspective, studying and reflecting the colonial and post-colonial relationships ethically and politically, can, I think, inspire climate ethics in its research, in its search for a change in social practices, in socio-political structures, in economy, and also in the everyday. So in the socialized habits of our everyday lives. Colonialism is socially unsustainable, and also climate colonialism is socially unsustainable, as it is indefensible from an impartial observer point of view, as Amartya Sen would say. The impartial observer would never justify that. Only a partial observer who is among those who benefit from it, who has vested interest, but an observer without vested interest, without partiality, an impartial, real impartial observer could not justify that or accept it. Let alone the view of the subaltern, to use a post-colonial theory term of Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. Her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Subaltern are those who are underprivileged in the colonial relationship and don't have a voice. And here we have also the poor, the indigenous in relation to climate change, And we have those in the future who are not yet existing. They also have no language, no voice. We need to represent them and to bring their voice in a representative way into the present political discussions. And also the new non-human beings, the biosphere, the critical zone, it has no voice. It must be represented in a way and brought into the political discussion. We need, and I conclude with that, a critique of imperial lifestyles. I like this term, imperiale Lebensform, by Ulrich Brand and Markus Wissen. We have adopted imperial lifestyles, not just to the global south, but also to those in the future and to the non-human biosphere. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very interesting introduction in social sustainability. I'm very fascinating, and I will definitely look deeper into it because it's such a fascinating topic. And I bet